A suitcase. A suitcase is a form of a luggage. It is a rectangular container with a handle and it's typically used to carry one's clothes and others' belonging while traveling. The first suitcase appeared in the late 19th century due to the increased popularity of mass tourism at the time, and they were meant to hold dress suits. But what if I told you a suitcase became a prison for Jorge Torres, and he found himself trapped inside, unable to escape, and he suffocated to death? And all of that happened while he was being filmed. This was a prank that turned deadly. Hello there, people of the internet. I'm your host, Mint, and welcome to today's case study. If you like true crime cases, make sure to leave a like and subscribe as we'll be covering more case studies in the upcoming future. So let's dive into today's case. Sarah Boone was an average middle-aged woman, a single mom with a creative streak, working hard to make ends meet. Born in 1977, and like many of us, she started out with dreams and ambition that were all too familiar. She was a single mother working hard to provide for her son. Sarah's upbringing was marked by turmoil and emotional instability. The specifics of her early ages are largely unknown to the public, but it is clear that she experienced a difficult and fractured childhood. Her family dynamics, like those of many others in area, were far from perfect. Sarah, like many children in similar environments, grew up in a home where love and safety were conditional. She had a complex relationship with her family, at times distant, at times close. But underlining it all was a sense of isolation. It was clear that Sarah was drawn to men who exhibited patterns of control, manipulation, and even abuse. Sarah's first marriage, though not much is known about it, ended after several years. Her ex-husband has said very little publicly, but sources close to Sarah describe the marriage as deeply troubled, often involving emotional manipulations on both sides. Like many women who end up in a toxic relationship, Sarah had a tendency to cling to the idea of love, even when it was clear that the relationship wasn't what it seemed. Sarah met Jorge Torres in 2018, and at first their connection seemed like a spark in the darkness. George, a man in his 40s, had his own set of problems. He came from a troubled background with a criminal history and struggles with drugs and alcohol. But Sarah was looking for someone to finally offer the emotional connection she was looking for years. George Torres was born in 1977, just a year before Sarah, in Florida. He grew up in a world that was far from easy. His life was one of hardship, marked by a string of bad choices and mistakes that shaped the man he would become. While not much is known about his childhood, George's adult life was complicated by struggles with addiction, brushes with the law, and troubled history of relationships. Throughout his adult life, George had several run-ins with the law, primarily revolving around the issues of theft, drug use, and other misdemeanors. These legal troubles painted a picture of a man who couldn't seem to get his footing in life. But for all the mistakes George made, there were people who still saw him as someone with potential, someone who could turn his life around. Much like Sarah, George's personal relationships were also marked by emotional turbulence. Friends and family members described him as a man who struggled with mental stability in his romantic life. He had been in a few serious relationships, but those ended up in heartbreak or turmoil. Some of these relationships, according to sources, were characterized by controlling behavior, substance abuse, and emotional violation. When George met Sarah in 2018, there seemed to be a chance for a fresh start. Sarah, in her own way, was a kind hearted spirit for George. Both had experienced significant emotional struggles, and connections between them was intense from the beginning. It wasn't just a relationship. It felt like kind of emotional reckoning for both of them. One of the major challenges George faced was his struggle with alcohol. While Sarah had her own history of drinking, George's addiction was equally problematic. Those close to him reported that his drinking often clouded his judgment, and at times he would become emotionally violent, making it hard for him to manage his relationships in a healthy way. In interviews, George admitted that alcohol had been a constant issue for him, and he knew it was something that needed to change. But despite his awareness, the pull of addiction was stronger, leaving him in a cycle he couldn't escape. Sarah, too, was caught in the cycle, and together their relationship became increasingly toxic. When Sarah met George in 2018, it seemed like a fresh start for both of them, right? Sarah had recently gone through some personal struggles, and George, well, George, despite his own troubles with addiction, appeared to offer her a connection that could heal her wounds. Their relationship was intense from the start. They bonded over shared struggles. George with his battle against addiction and Sarah with her emotional needs. Sarah, who had history of toxic relationships, saw George as someone who could be the one to love her. George too seemed to believe that Sarah was something he could build his future with. But as is often the cases with relationship marked by emotional baggage, things quickly become complicated. At first, their relationship was full of passion, but also marked with frequent arguments. Alcohol played a significant role early on. Both Sarah and George drank heavily, and it didn't take long for their partying lifestyle to turn toxic. Jealousy became a constant theme in their relationship. Sarah, who struggled with insecurities and a fear of abandonment, was prone of accusing George of cheating or being unfaithful. George, on the other hand, resented these accusations and in his defense led to explosive arguments. What started as a minor disagreement quickly escalated into bigger confrontations, fueled by alcohol, jealousy, and a lack of trust. Sarah's emotional needs often led to her feel rejected, and she demanded more attentions and validations from George. Meanwhile, George's inability to handle emotional confrontations led to him withdrawing or lashing out in anger. This toxic cycle of clinging and withdrawing was a pattern that repeated itself throughout their relationship. There were reports of both verbal and emotional abuse in their relationship. George's mood could shift unpredictably, especially when alcohol was involved. On the other hand, Sarah's behavior was no less intense. Her fear of abandonment and her desire for validation often led her to lash out as well. In fact, friends and families would later recall the emotional and psychological toll their relationship took on both of them. But it was clear that Sarah was increasingly drawn to the idea of trying to fix George, while he became frustrated with the emotional hold she had on him. As months went on, their relationship seemed to be a constant state of crisis. At one point, Sarah began to express a strong desire for George to change, hoping that their love could overcome his addiction. However, George was unable or unwilling to meet Sarah's emotional demands, and his addiction continued to take its toll. Instead of healing, their relationship became a battleground for control and a test of emotional endurance. By the time February 2020 rolled around, George and Sarah's relationship had reached its breaking point. On February 23rd, 2020, Sarah and George were spending an evening together in their apartment. The night began like any other night, drinking, laughing, and playing games. Both of them had been drinking alcohol throughout the evening. Sarah, in what she later described as a joke, suggested that George climb inside a suitcase. Sarah claimed that it was a playful suggestion, and George, who had a history of goofing around with her, seemed to go ahead with it. However, this joke quickly turned fatal. In a discussion that would later haunt her, Sarah zipped George inside a suitcase. According to Sarah, the situation began as a playful banter, but things quickly took a dangerous turn. Once inside the suitcase, George began to panic. The small confined space made it difficult for him to breathe, and he became increasingly frantic. George's desperation became evident. He begged Sarah to let him out, but the reality of his predicament set in. He was unable to escape. The weight of the zipper combined with the tight space inside the suitcase caused him to suffocate slowly. His cries for help were recorded by Sarah throughout the time. One of the most disturbing aspects of this tragedy is the video that Sarah recorded on her phone during George's final moments. In the footage, George's voice can be heard, strained and desperate, as he pleads for Sarah to open the suitcase and let him out. In the video, George can be heard gasping for air, pleading with Sarah to let him out. His voice, once calm, grows more strained and desperate, his cries for help echoing through the recording, his voice breaking as he struggles inside the confined space. Yet, instead of acting on his pleas, Sarah continues to film. At one point in the video, George's cries grow fainter as he begins to lose consciousness. The sound of his breathing becomes more shallow, but Sarah, on the other hand, continues filming. The fact that she didn't even stop to intervene and free him from the suitcase raises a question about her emotional state and what was going through her mind at the time. When George stopped responding, Sarah eventually opened the suitcase. But by then it was too late. George had suffocated and his body was unresponsive. Shockingly, Sarah did not make a 911 call right away. She delayed, seeking help, and instead spent hours in a state of confusion and denial. It wasn't until the next day, after confiding in a friend about the events, that Sarah finally contacted the authorities. However, by that time, George was already dead. After George was found dead, Sarah called 911 in the early hours of February 24, 2020. The call, which took place hours after the tragic incident, revealed Sarah's frantic and emotional state. However, what was most notable about the call was how vague Sarah was about the details of George's death.
I put him in a case and we were playing, and
Okay.
like kind of hide and seek kind of thing. So I fell asleep and I woke up and he was dead in the suitcase. So I don't know what happened.
From the very start of the call, Sarah's lack of clarity raises a red flag. She does not explain how George came to be in the suitcase or why she waited so long to contact the authorities. She mentions that George is unresponsive but does not offer any immediate indications of what caused his condition, making her responses seem detached from the urgency of the situation.
Okay. So he was in a suitcase?
Yes, and I fell asleep.
The 911 dispatcher tries to keep Sarah calm while asking critical questions. The dispatcher repeatedly urges Sarah to check George for the signs of life, asking if he is breathing and if she can perform a CPR.
I need you to get him on the floor, flat on his back for
I
me,
did.
okay?
I did. I tried giving him CPR.
All right. Do you right by him now?
I'm sorry?
Are you right by him now?
Yes.
Okay. Lay him flat on his. Okay, ma'am, listen. Is he cold and stiff?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, he's not
Okay.
necessarily cold, but he's stiff. And he's
Right. Okay.
purple.
Despite the operator's urgency, Sarah does not seem to respond to the request to perform a CPR. In fact, she continues to provide disjointed answers, failing to take the necessary actions. It became very clear that she is either unwilling or unable to help George, further reinforcing the nature of her behavior. What in particular is striking about the 911 call is what Sarah does not say. While she expresses her distress over George's unresponsiveness, she fails to mention the suitcase at first. It's only later in the call she reveals George was inside the suitcase. In fact, the dispatcher asks for more details.
And you found him in a suitcase, you said?
Yes. We were playing hide and seek last night. I fell asleep. Come in. Can I stop huffing now?
Let them take over for you, okay?
One of the most troubling aspects of the 911 call is the time lapse between the incident and Sarah's call for help. George had died hours earlier, yet Sarah didn't contact the authorities until the following morning. The delay in seeking help, especially given the nature of the situation, further raised suspicions about Sarah's involvement and her emotional detachment. Why did she wait so long to call? At the time of the call, Sarah described herself as feeling shocked and confused, as though she couldn't comprehend the seriousness of the situation. But investigators later argued that her delayed responses and vague statements indicated the lack of urgency and to confront the reality of George's death. It was clear that Sarah's statements were at odds with the evidence they later uncovered. The autopsy showed that George had died from suffocation, and the investigation revealed that he had been locked inside the suitcase for a long period of time.
So the cause of death, which I put on the death certificate, is positional asphyxia with environmental suffocation.
The forensic analysis, on the other hand, of the suitcase revealed several crucial details that helped piece together the timeline of the events.
So there were some blunt impact injuries to his head. I don't think it's on this one, but there were some blunt impact injuries to his head right up here around the eye and on the mouth area. It's a series of ecchymoses on the left side of the back, which right about here.
While there were no signs of external injuries, the cause of death was determined to be suffocation. This is where the suitcase played a central role, by restricting George's ability to breathe. What stood out during the investigations was the fact that George had no way of getting out of the suitcase. He was completely immobile and his struggles were futile. The fact that the zipper was on the outside of the suitcase suggested that Sarah had placed him intentionally, locking him and leaving him to suffocate. When Sarah was questioned by the police, she offered a version of events which she claimed that George got into the suitcase as a part of a game or prank.
We were drinking. We had a bottle of wine last night. Okay. So then it's like we decided to play hide and seek, right? Okay. So he gets in the suitcase. Okay.
She said she didn't even realize how serious the situation had become until it was too late. According to Sarah, she had zipped George inside the suitcase as a joke, thinking he would find it funny. and left him there for a short period while she went to the other room. However, the evidence didn't align with Sarah's explanation. For one, George's body was found inside the suitcase hours later with no signs of him trying to escape or even attempting to get out. The fact that Sarah didn't immediately realize the danger of trapping George inside the suitcase raised red flags for investigators. In her interviews, Sarah claimed that George had been intoxicated and that she thought the situation was harmless. But the longer the investigation continued, the more it became clear that her action went beyond simple misunderstanding. The absence of any attempts to help George after he was trapped inside, along the delay in her calling 911, suggested a much more sinister sequence of events. The video, which lasts for several minutes, showed George clearly unable to escape. The video gave investigators and later the jury insight into just how disturbed Sarah's behavior was during the entire event. George was in grave danger, yet Sarah seemed to be unaware of, or more disturbingly, indifferent to the consequences of trapping him inside the suitcase. The trial of Sarah officially began in 2022, nearly 2 years after the death of George. The prosecution opened with a strong statement arguing that the case was clear. Sarah intentionally killed George. They had emphasized that Sarah trapped George inside the suitcase, filmed him as he struggled, and then failed to act to save him. They pointed to the video evidence where Sarah could be heard laughing while George begged for help. The prosecution case relied heavily on the video Sarah took, which showed George's desperate cries for help while Sarah appeared indifferent, even amused. They argued that Sarah had no intentions of rescuing George and had trapped him in the suitcase with full knowledge of their consequences. Their argument painted Sarah as callouts, someone who used George's suffering as a form of entertainment. The jury saw Sarah's laughter, heard George's pleas, and understood the gravity of the situation. In the eyes of the prosecutions, this wasn't a case of a woman who made a bad decision under pressure. It was an act of someone who was deliberately indifferent to the fate of a person she loved. But the prosecution had made a compelling case that her actions were reckless, leading to George's preventable death. In March 2023, after weeks of deliberation, the jury returned.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree as charged in the information.
Sarah Boone was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Jorge Torres. Following the conviction, Sarah was sentenced to 20 years in prison for second-degree murder. The sentencing served as a reminder of the devastating consequences of recklessness behavior and the importance of responsibility in a relationship. The case also served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking a light-hearted approach to something as serious as another person's safety. For George's family, the aftermath of his death was a painful and lasting experience. His family members were devastated by the loss of someone they loved deeply. News outlets, true crime enthusiasts, and social media platforms all reacted strongly to the footage and the trial's outcome. Many experienced outrage at Sarah's action, questioning how someone could so carelessly treat the life of another human being, especially someone they claim to love. A case where poor decisions, substance abuse, and indifference to another person's suffering led to irreversible loss. And with that being said, I've been your host, Smith. If I said anything offensive during the video, I truly apologize. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.